I was 10 years old and visiting my grandparents' house in Roscoe, New York. My grandparents had a large field behind their house that was surrounded by the forest, and that weekend, my cousin and I decided to go out camping in the woods. And as a kid, that was always a great time. We all ate a bunch of snacks and drank a ton of soda. And since we didn't have any adults with us, we weren't allowed to have a fire. Instead, we used electric lanterns to light up the area around our tents and inside. That night started out super fun, and we all enjoyed ourselves by playing some games and fighting with some sticks before going to bed. However, after going to sleep, things took a really terrifying turn. It was still pretty early in the night, mustn't have been too far past 11 p.m., when the sound of branches snapping outside my tent woke me up. I listened closely as the sound of footsteps began growing closer and closer to our grouping of tents. I could hear my cousin around me waking up, and we all began talking quietly through our tents to one another, asking if we knew what it was. And after the sound of our voices, we could hear whatever had been in our campsites going running off into the woods. All of us were pretty on edge, but after a little while of talking to one another through our tents, one by one, we all slowly began to fall back asleep. That time, I feel like I managed to sleep for a little while before being woken up again. At this time, it wasn't something as light as the sound of footsteps that woke me up. This time, it was something physical. After sleeping for however long, I was woken up by the feeling of someone pulling on my ankle. I felt a hand reach into my tent and wrap its fingers around my ankle. I immediately began kicking and screaming, and at first, it felt like whoever it was wasn't going to let go. But after screaming, I could once again hear my cousin waking up, and they could hear the fear in my scream, and they all began making a commotion. At the sound of multiple kids waking up and screaming at the top of their lungs, whoever it was that had grabbed a hold of me decided to let go, and I could hear them running away into the woods. None of us wasted any time, and we all sprang out of our tents and began running back toward my grandparents' house. Thankfully, it was in the opposite direction of whoever had snuck into our camp. We all made it back to my grandparents safe and sound, and we explained to them what happened after we woke them up by barging into the house. My grandpa began questioning my uncles because he suspected that they had been messing with us. But when he saw how worried they got for our safety, I think they all knew that it was exactly something more serious than a bad prank. We all made our statements to the police, and my grandparents ended up getting cameras placed around their property in case whoever it was decided to come back. One of the best places I have ever had the luxury of visiting was Australia. When I was 13 years old, my family and I went on vacation for 2 weeks to Sydney, Australia. And during that vacation, we did everything that you could imagine. We went out on a few fishing trips, we visited the famous Bondi Beach, and my favorite part of the trip was the 3 days that we went camping in the outback with a small tour group. That was a bunch of fun, except for the second night. On the second night, I had an experience that still makes my skin crawl thinking about it. When we had first met up with our tour group, we were told by our guides that they couldn't guarantee what kind of wildlife we would see, but if we were lucky, we would get a chance to spot a couple of Australia's native wildlife, which of course includes kangaroos. I was super excited to see some kangaroos in real life. They were always very interesting to me. Sadly, we didn't run into any while we were camping, but that didn't mean it was a waste of a trip though. We still had a blast. The other family that was camping with us was really friendly, and we all got along really well. On the first day, we just enjoyed a bit of hiking and sightseeing, followed by an evening spent around the campfire eating some junk and sharing stories. We mainly spent the time listening to our guides recount certain things that they had seen while working as an outdoor guide. Most of the stories had to do with the animals that they had seen, and they assured us that though the Australian wilderness can be intimidating, it also is a very beautiful place once you understand it. There was one point in the first night that set us all on edge, all of us except for the guides. It happened right before we all decided to turn in for bed. As we were sitting around the fire, we could hear the sound of something moving in the grass around us. We couldn't see what it was, but we could hear something that sounded like it was slowly scurrying around. Each step it took almost sounded like something scratching against the ground. The guides immediately saw that we all had gotten a bit tense, and they did their best to ease our minds by telling us that it was likely a small rodent and nothing to worry about. And while I'm sure none of us believed them 100%, we all ended up taking their word for it, and after a while, we returned to our tents. My mom and dad were sharing a tent, and I had a single-sized tent for myself. Before going inside, my dad made sure to tell me to seal the tent up tight so that nothing can get in. We had been smart and brought the tape with us to run alongside the seam of our tent and the bottom of the flap to make sure nothing can get in while we sleep, mainly thinking about bugs and mosquitoes. That night, after I finally managed to get to sleep, we went by without any incidents. As far as I know, we all slept through the night, and by the time the morning came around, we were all re-energized and ready for whatever the guides had planned. That day we spent fishing on a small river near the campsite, and then we all just hung around the camp enjoying our time in the wilderness. That night started out the same as the previous one, with all of us around the fire enjoying some snacks and talking about the day and swapping other stories. Our fun was quickly stopped, however, when we heard the scratching sound again. We didn't know what it was, but we could hear it periodically moving around the campsite. But every time we tried to look for it, there was nothing to be seen. This time, we were all a bit more concerned because now we were actively looking for whatever had been making that noise, and we just could not find it. After a bit of looking, though, our guides tried to once again dismiss it as a small rodent. They said something along the lines of, "See how fast those mice are? You can't even see them when they run by you." This got a laugh out of all of us, which ultimately calmed us down, and in no time, we all put the strange scurrying noise out of our minds. As we all went into our tents that night, we once again made sure to tape up the bottom of our tents to make sure that no unwanted visitors made it inside. And after doing that, it wasn't long before I was sound asleep. I'm unsure of how long I was asleep exactly, but at one point, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling like I needed to use the bathroom. So I quickly got out of my sleeping bag and made my way out of the tent to relieve myself. And after doing that, I returned back to my tent and laid down. Now, I was still half asleep at the time, so I hadn't remembered to reseal my tent with the tape. But nevertheless, I was asleep in no time. I was only asleep for a few minutes this time, before waking up to the scratching and scurrying sound that we all had been hearing over the past 2 nights. My eyes shot open as I could tell that the sound was much closer. In fact, it sounded as if the scratching was now on the material that made up my tent. I could hear whenever it was slowly moving up the side of my tent near where my head had been resting. And though it was dark, I could make out the shadow of something about the size of my fist on the side of my tent. I quickly reached for my flashlight and shined it on whatever had woken me up. And when I saw what it was, I screamed so loud that the guides had thought an animal had attacked me. Sitting on my tent, no more than a foot from my face, was a massive huntsman spider. And though they are typically harmless to people, I still had never been so freaked out in my life. I ran out of my tent, and after being calmed down by my family and the guides, I spent the rest of the night by the fire until the sun fully came up. Thankfully, it was only about an hour at that point. After finishing out a grueling semester, a couple of friends and I decided to go camping for a week in Northern California. We planned the trip for about a week to make sure that we had everything that we needed, and we looked up places where it was legal for us to go camp for free. We found a small area that seemed like it would be perfect for us, and before we all knew it, we were arriving at the trail that we planned on using to get to this campground that we had found. The trail was beautiful and very wide and easy to walk along, and by the time we made it to the campsite, we were all eager to set up our gear and then go exploring a bit. As we walked around the woods that surrounded our camp, all of us were very happy to be there, since to us this marked the official start to what would hopefully be a great summer vacation. The fresh air was amazing, and it wasn't too hot out either. It was just pure bliss at first. Our biggest complaint at the time would have probably been all of the trash that had been lying around. There were beer cans and wrappers everywhere. We talked about grabbing a trash bag at some point while we were there and picking it all up, but sadly, we never got to do that. At the time, we were so consumed with how relaxing it was, and you know what they say, time flies when you're enjoying yourself. And in no time, we all found ourselves sitting by the fire, cooking up some dinner and enjoying each other's company. A couple of hours passed since it had gotten dark, and after a bit, we all decided that it would be a good time to turn in and get some sleep. So we all went into our tents, whether it be one that we were sharing with someone or in single tents. We all said our goodnights, and we went to get a good night of sleep, or so we thought. It was probably about 45 minutes after going into my tent when I started to hear the sound of something moving outside of the campground. And at first, I assumed that it was just a small animal, so I just waited to see what else I could hear. Sure enough, the movement that I was hearing began moving closer and into the campsite. That was when I hear my buddy Mark call out from his tent asking if someone was outside right now, and I responded by saying that it was probably an animal. That was when all of us began yelling loudly and making noises that we assumed would scare whatever it was that was exploring our camp. After a couple of seconds of yelling, we all fell quiet and just listened to see if we could hear anything. And my heart stopped when I hear a voice that we didn't recognize. "You know you guys sound like idiots, right?" said what sounded like a grown man who couldn't have been standing more than 5 feet away from my tent. "Come on out, we aren't gonna hurt you," the voice called out again. None of us even attempted to move. We were all too terrified. After a moment of silence, we could hear the sound of more people groaning and sighing, which was right before whoever began throwing things at our tent, as objects began to make an impact within the thin piece of fabric that separated us from the intruders. We all began to scream and call out for help, and for the next 5 minutes or so, whoever it was continued to run around our tents, kicking at them and throwing objects at them. It was horrifying, and it sounded like everyone was in tears from the fear at that point. That was when I heard Mark from his tent. I could tell he was getting angry at the situation, and he began yelling back at our assailants. And when I heard him get up and begin unzipping his tent, I didn't want to get hurt, but I knew he needed my support in this situation. So I too got up to confront whoever was harassing us. But as I began to poke my head out of my tent, all we could see was what it looked like a small group of 5 or so people running back into the woods. Mark yelled out to them, and one looked back at us, and before I could react, I saw him throwing something and felt the hard, cold glass of a bottle bounce off my forehead. The group laughed as they ran off. None of us got any sleep that night, and the next day we cleaned up as fast as we could and headed back to our cars. The craziest part was what we saw when we were leaving, though. As we all were pulling out of the parking lot near the head of the trail that we had walked down, we could see a few people standing on the tree line, 2 of which appeared to even be waving at us. Needless to say that we didn't waste any time getting out of there and headed back to our town as quickly as we could.